You're listening to 91.3 FM, WCUW in Worcester, Massachusetts, Dr. Chris Radio Horror program. You're not listening to us live on Radio Horror or catching this on streaming or on a podcast format on Radio Free America. Hopefully you're catching this on the YouTube channel. But don't forget, Radio Free America is connected to WCUW now for all of your podcasting needs and wants of every show that appears on WCUW for all of its music and counterculture, chit-chat, and everything that we happen to do here. It's multicultural. We cover everything all over the planet. Trust me, you wouldn't believe what we're covering these days. On tonight's show, talking about the amazing animated film that was just released, Batman: Gotham by Gaslight, as well as other times the Dark Knight has fought supernatural entities and weird mumbo jumbo. We have from Crisis to Crisis, and it all comes back to Superman podcasts. Michael Bailey on the show with us once again. Thank you for joining me, Michael.
Yeah, because the guy you want to grab for a Batman show is a guy that does a couple Superman shows. That makes me laugh for some reason. No, thank you for having me back on the show. I do appreciate it.
But you also do you do a Batman show too.
Yeah, it's called The Overlooked Dark Knight. Andy Leyland and I, a friend of mine from the UK, get together about twice a month and talk about Batman comics we don't think get enough attention.
Yeah.
So we've been doing that for almost a year now, and it's been a lot of fun.
You know what you should do, because there's a couple guys on the Wire, not the Baltimore cop show. The Water and Fire Network are doing the Superman minute by minute, 5 minutes by 5 minutes. You should do a Batman movie.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd be up for that. The Fire and Water guys, Rob and Chris, who were nice enough to have me on that show a couple of times. I don't want to get into that pond just yet. And but Andy, here's the thing, Andy, my co-host, we have the most boring planning sessions ever. Because I go, hey, you want to do this? He's like, sure. And then we do it. So there's no hemming and hawing. There's no him, having an issue with wanting to do something. It's just usually if I suggest something, he's amenable to it. So you never know. We may do commentaries for the films at some point.
My co-host for the Dead TV podcast and I did a commentary for the god-awful adaptation of the Constantine comic book, Constantine, starring Keanu Reeves, when we were doing the Constantine television show. And I said to her, hey, we're doing the Spawn animated movie. Let's do the Spawn film commentary.
Do the director's cut.
Yeah, we would do the director's cut, and then I'm going to ship it off to, because I still have his email address, and I've talked to him once in a while, I will ship it off to Michael J. White.
Hey, he might appreciate it.
Which, his interview unfortunately got lost to the annals of time and space and will never be found again unless I find some device that it happens to be on. But his panel is one of the most popular videos I have on my YouTube channel. Very nice guy, by the way, if you ever meet him in person. And he was in a Batman movie, going back to Batman. He was in the Dark Knight. He was the guy who gets unfortunately comfortable with a pencil.
No, he's he gets his mouth cut up.
Wait, I thought he got his head slammed on the table with the pencil.
No, that was one of the minions.
Oh, right. Okay. Right. All right. Shame on me. Also, considering it's the 10th anniversary of The Dark Knight this year. Mm-hmm. It's anniversaries of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of anniversaries this year.
A lot of anniversaries. Is there any major Batman anniversary before we get to Batman and the Supernatural? Besides The Dark Knight?
Let me think.
Anything in comics particularly? Like, when did Jason Todd get?
That will be 30 years this October.
Wow, there you go.
40 years since the Filmation animated series hit in 68, or 50 years, excuse me. I can do math, I promise. 70 years since the Joe Chill story got told. I mean, the thing I have found with anniversaries since I've gotten pretty involved at Dragon Con, which is the large sci-fi fantasy convention that happens in Atlanta over Labor Day weekend. since I've got into that, and a lot of the tracks do anniversaries, you can find anniversaries for just about anything. So I'm sure there's like a Batman villain that's celebrating his 70th or 60th or 50th anniversary this year.
We were talking on Facebook. We were talking on Facebook a little bit, and this is where I kind of came up with this idea after watching the Batman Gotham by Gaslight, which is, I think, considered to be the very first Elseworlds tale. And before we get into some of our favorite supernatural horror stories of Batman, what did you think of the film?
I'm sorry, you blanked a little there. What film?
Okay, let me start over again. This idea came from when you came on the show and we talked about Superman versus the Supernatural, and I said, hey, let's do Batman versus the Supernatural as well to tie into Radio of Horror. But it was also coincidence that we were coming up on the release of the animated film, which does have some horror elements in it, Batman Gotham by Gaslight, a superb animated film from the creator of Hellboy, Mike Mignola. What did you think of the film?
Okay, here's where I think my wires got crossed a little bit, because I read the comic, but I haven't seen the film yet. I'm terrible. I apologize. But, however, talking about the things I have seen of the film, it looks like it's going to be amazing in terms of animation. I like the addition of Selena Kyle as a character in the film, because it kind of gives a major female role to the story, where in the comic the women are there just pretty much to get murdered, which with Jack the Ripper you kind of expect, but still, it's 2018. We've come a little far in storytelling since then. It looks like, and you could spoil it for me if you want to. It looks like they're adding elements from both Gotham by Gaslight and Master of the Future, because there's a dirigible at one point, which was the major climax of the sequel to Gotham by Gaslight, which I kind of like. And the only thing that kind of made me go, was there's a scene where he's dealing with a bunch of young hoodlums, and they're named Dick and Jason. Yeah. And I thought that was a little on the nose. Like all of his Robins are there, just in one little group. But my life has been crazy for the past couple of weeks. I have the film. It's sitting on my coffee table, but we haven't been able to crack into it just yet. So I did read the comic, so I apologize profusely. I thought we were talking the comic, not the movie.
No, that's fine. But the no spoilers. But obviously, if you've seen the trailer or any of the artwork, you do know that there is the blimp, the Dillinger. So there are elements from Masters of the Future in there, but it is a vastly different story from what you read in the comics. Like, the comic was, very linear, I thought, and in a good way. This goes in a completely different direction with the Jack the Ripper story that you're like, what? No! And I was a little pissed, but in the end, I still enjoyed the whole thing.
Oh, very cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Don't worry, there's no, Joker or any of that crap that happens, you know what I mean? It's like, Jesus Christ, I thank God they didn't, go, oh, we gotta throw the Joker in there because... And I'm like... I swear to God, if I see the Joker in anything else, I'm going to scream. I'm already pissed about Gotham, the TV series. But what's funny, though, I was watching, before we actually get to the supernatural part, I watched something this week I was so proud to have watched, and I swear I would love to talk to this guy and have him on the show sometime. But I just got done watching Batman and Bill, and I'm so happy that despite my feelings about Batman versus Superman and my mixed feelings about Gotham, and yes, I do watch it to this very day, they were the first to put Bill Finger's name on the Batman creative credits.
Are you talking the director or Mark Tyler Nobleman, who was one of the spearheading and wrote that book?
I think the narrator director of the documentary, the guy who's in it throughout.
Yeah, I don't have Hulu, so I haven't been able to see this yet. But I'm kind of looking forward to it because the Bill Finger thing is, at one point, something I was extremely passionate about in terms of being angry at the injustice that was done. Mm-hmm. I've kind of mellowed on that in the last couple of years because, history is complicated. And, we can vilify Bob Kane all day long, and there seems to be a lot that you can vilify him for.
Well, if you watch that documentary, you definitely vilify him.
At the same time, and Neil Adams kind of made this point in an interview with Kevin Smith that, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster fought for their creative rights. And apparently, and it could be just it was his personality, or it could be by the end of his life, Bill Finger was having so many problems that he just didn't have the fight in him. But I think now, though, and another reason why I've kind of calmed down about the whole thing is that attention is being paid to, quote, Death of a Salesman. And he is getting the richly deserved credit he did for taking a domino masked, red suit wearing Birdman and kind of turning him into the Batman that we got in 1939 and still in one form or another exists to this day.
Yeah, his early drawings of Batman, I was like, what the hell?
Well, that, to be fair, which is apparently something I'm known to say, that would have been an acceptable costume back then. It's just not a costume that you look at and go, wow, that's got 80 years of longevity. Whereas, a bat, that kind of works. So, and it's very Gothic to do a very ham-fisted segue.
And what's funny is that Bill's name actually showed up in Batman mythos as like a side character or the name of a street or something here and there before the Batman versus Superman movie or Gotham stuck his name in the credits.
Yeah, you would see, most of the people who have been adapting comic books just in general over the past, I would say, probably about 30 years or so. If you've ever had a chance to listen to any of the BBC productions that a writer-director named Dirk Maggs produced, he put out something called, Batman-related, he put out something called The Lazarus Syndrome in 1988. And then he also did, it's gone under like two names. In the United States, it was released as Batman Nightfall. But I think in the UK it was known as Batman Nightfall and Beyond, where he adapted Sword of Azrael and certain parts of the Nightfall, Knight's Quest, and Knight's End storyline. Mm-hmm. And the cool thing about them is that Michael Gough is Alfred in them. So the Alfred from the movies is the voice in all of these productions. I'd recommend them. They're available. You can find them legitimately, which is kind of nice. But even there, they had things on Kane Avenue, and they would even Maggs went real deep, did some deep cuts by having like Gorfinkel and Peterson, naming editors and assistant editors and stuff like that. So that's and the animated series was always about dropping Batman creator names in their street names and such. So I always like that too. It's a non-distracting Easter egg.
One particular comic book, which there's nothing horrific about it. Well, no, let me rephrase that. There's nothing supernatural about it, but it was a book that I had mentioned to you on Facebook, and in fact, it was the very first Batman comic book I can remember reading when the Batman movie in 1989 came out when I was 9 years old, and you could say it was the comic book that could have scarred me for life because of how horrendous it was, but it was Batman finding dead girls in dumpsters all cut up.
Yeah, that was the, I believe that issue is Batman 413?
Something like that, and it had the title The New Adventures of Batman right after the Crisis on Infinite Earths had happened, correct?
Yes, and I'm wrong. It was Batman 414. That was Jim Starlin's first issue.
Right.
As writer, and he would stick around until Batman 430, which was the issue after Death in the Family ends. And I recommend it. I want them to do kind of like a trade paperback collecting all of Jim Starlin's run, and they've pretty much done that by this point between two different books. But 430 actually resolves that crime that happens in 414. So you find out who was killing those girls, which, in a weird way, kind of ties into Gotham by Gaslight.
Yeah, definitely. In a kind of a way, the way the killer is dispatching women. Now, were the women in the story just women, or are they street women?
No, they were just women.
Okay. The politically correct term of prostitution, or whatever else you want to call them. There was a book that we talked about last time, which actually has a sequel in Batman. We talked a little bit about Superman Metropolis, being kind of the prequel to Batman Nosferatu, which was this very silent film noir painted graphic novel that Mike Carlin, when he came on the show, said that was one of his favorites.
That is one of those... Okay, so for those of you familiar with the 90s, there were a lot of Batman Elseworlds stories.
Oh, God. They printed money.
There are more Batman Elseworlds stories, I think, together than all of the other DC characters combined. I don't have hard numbers on that. So there were a bunch that I read. At one point, I did read the Red Rain trilogy, which I haven't read in years. I really need to reread that because I enjoyed those books quite a bit.
Oh, that was like the book that I kept secret from my parents, that if they ever knew I was reading, I would never hear the end of it from my father.
It was 3 different specials written by Doug Mensch with art by Kelly Jones, which detailed Batman becoming a vampire, like an out and out, straight up blood-sucking vampire. And it is a very weird style. It is not illustrative. Basically it's the closest Batman has ever come, and he had a run on Batman with Doug Mensch in the 90s after 0 Hour. It's the closest I think Batman has ever come to looking Vertigo. Or looking like a Vertigo book, because the anatomy's a little different. The ears are like 16 feet tall, and the cape stretches out. It's just like Kelly Jones looked at Todd McFarlane and Bernie Wrightson and said, you know what? I think we can stretch that out a little farther. But it was just this really great horror story of Batman dealing with the fact that he is now one of the undead. So when I saw Nosferatu on the shelf and I didn't have God, how much was it back then? Like $6-7 a comic?
Oh no, even cheaper than that.
Oh, okay.
You're thinking of prestige books nowadays are about $7, but back then they were still like either $4.99 or $3.99.
Yeah, but that was still more than your standard comic at the time.
Yes, which was to like $2, all just getting over $2.
So that was one of the ones that I missed, but I would love to hear about it.
Can I describe the plot line to Batman Nosferatu? No, it is just... Have you ever tried to watch a German expressionist film that everyone raves about, but then when you watch, you're left going, I need to rewatch that a couple of times?
Yeah, you have no real, like you know that there's a film in there, and you know at some point you're going to quote-unquote crack the code with it. Like, suddenly everything will make sense. But your friends have gotten it before you, and you're not there yet, but you're not really saying anything because you don't want to look stupid.
Mm-hmm. And they were supposed to make another one, which I don't think that they ever did, or if they did, I have not seen it anywhere. The Blue Amazon.
You know, but to be fair, I love the idea that with the Elseworlds concept, and for people listening that may not know what we're talking about, because Elseworlds haven't been a thing for some time at DC Comics.
In fact, do you know what the last Elseworlds tale was?
It was a Superman one, wasn't it?
The Last Family of Krypton.
That's right. Yeah, it was that 3-issue Prestige series. Written by Cary Bates.
Yep, where Jor-El was smart enough to build a big rocket, not a little tiny rocket.
And I think that one had been sitting in the files for a while when they finally released it, because Elseworlds was an imprint DC launched. Gotham by Gaslight is sometimes attributed as being the first. It actually wasn't. I believe that honor goes to Holy Terror, which was written by Alan Brennert and drawn by Norm Breyfogle. But it was basically they were telling stories of DC characters, but completely changing them. So and Marvel has a series that's similar to this called What If. But what If does is it takes a storyline, like, what if Spider-Man was never separated from the symbiote? So everything is normal up until that point, and then they tell the story as it unfolds after that with a change. Elseworlds would take place in different times, different countries, different planets, and they would be a little more expansive. Now, some of them weren't as good. There is a Batman one called In Darkest Night, where he becomes a Green Lantern, which I don't like at all. I like everyone involved with it. I just didn't like the story. But in the 90s, it was just like this explosion of Elseworld stories. And in the early 2000s, they finally put a kibosh on that. So, but when Nosferatu came out and when Metropolis came out, it was this time where they were just like, let's do German expressionist superhero stories. And I thought that was brilliant.
You gotta wonder if they were doing that to compete with Marvel, because What If was pretty popular.
Yeah, What If was insanely popular. One of the last issues launched Spider-Girl.
Correct.
Like 108 or something like that, and that became one of those books that was
105
that came out and is now worth a good bit of money because it had a very low print run.
Mm-hmm.
But Elseworlds were usually on nicer paper, and they were 90% Batman.
Yeah, and then of course they did the entire year of annuals of all Elseworlds sales.
Yeah, and that's just because Batman was rising to his ascendancy as being one of the most popular characters DC publishes, thanks to the Tim Burton film in 1989, and then super thanks to the animated series. He was more in the pop culture zeitgeist than he had been since the 60s. And DC was going to milk that cow for all it was worth, and God bless them for doing that.
And I was right. The Blue Amazon was published. I just have not ever seen a copy of it, so maybe I'm just not looking hard enough. But that was the final chapter of the German expressionist film noir DC stories.
Yeah, I know that Gotham that a lot of the Elseworlds are getting released digitally on Comixology. Is Metropolis and Nosferatu available there yet, or have they not gotten to that?
I don't usually look for a lot of digital books, except for unless I absolutely need it. I do own Metropolis and Nosferatu, so I haven't looked for the Blue Amazon yet.
So I eventually it's going to get there. DC, I will have to say, has been very good about getting their comics available for Comixology. To a certain extent, with some of them, you're missing out on things like the ads and the letters pages.
Mm-hmm. Well, these Elseworld books
elements
never had
that kind of tie it to a specific time period, but at least you're getting the story, and that's kind of the more important thing.
Excuse me. The thing I can say about the Elseworlds, the Nosferatu story before we move on from it, is they changed a lot of the names in it. I do remember to things like Bruce Wayne and Dirk Grayson and Clark. Well, like Clark Kent is said, but it's like it's said differently, like the way you would say it in German. And then like Bruce Wayne has a multi-interest love affair with Barbara Gordon. And he's investigating Arkham because he's trying to find out where the Superman came from. Superman, like Spider-Man. And he gets captured, if I remember correctly, and transformed into this Nosferatu creature.
That sounds amazing.
And then it's up to Superman, who's basically turned Metropolis into like the film Metropolis, to stop this creature of Gotham.
That sounds actually kind of cool. I'm not normally down with the Superman versus Batman stories, but at least that one makes sense. And it's it's an Elseworlds story, so it doesn't count.
I could see why after that movie was put out. There is Batman and vampires obviously so heavily tied together, and you can see why. And the Dark Reign, the Red Reign trilogy, where Batman becomes a vampire. I thought peaked by Volume 2, and then in the early 2000s or late 1990s, we got Volume 3, where it went right off the rails into like the most horrific horror story you could put Batman involved with. And Batman will be brought back later on to be involved with vampires in the Batman animated series had a one and only standalone movie where Batman fights Dracula in it.
That was really good. That was actually the first bit of that animated series that I'd ever seen. I avoided it because it was the early 2000s. I was in my late 20s. It wasn't Batman the animated series, and I wasn't having that.
And it wasn't Justice League.
Yeah, and it wasn't Justice League. But I finally caught that movie. It was on Netflix, and it was I think around Halloween back in 2010 or so. And my wife and I sat down and watched it, and I was like, you know what? This isn't all that bad. This is actually kind of entertaining. I remember enjoying that film quite a bit.
I ordered it on eBay many years later, and I got I found somebody on eBay selling it for $7.99, but in the box set that comes with the little PVC Batman and Dracula figures.
Ooh, that's kind of cool.
And I was like,
to have on the shelf.
Yeah, very, very cool. Because Dracula's figure looks kind of cool. I'm not in love with the Joker and the Penguin becoming vampires. I thought that was so stupid. But the plot line about how Batman cures everyone in Gotham or kills the vampires, he doesn't kill them, obviously, because it's a kid's cartoon, reminds me very much of the plot line of how Charlie Brewster takes care of the vampires in the Fright Night remake. Very similar.
You talk about Batman and vampires, though. When you go back to some of the earliest Batman stories, he's actually fighting vampires.
Correct, and he's killing them too.
There's this great story, and it was actually a continued story, which is, some people it was rare back then, and that's true to a certain extent. But I think since comic books came primarily based on comic strips, and comic strips were a continued story, it's not that out of the realm of weirdness that they would do that. But it was reprinted. The first time I read it was in the Greatest Batman Stories Ever Told, which was a collection put out in 1988, and a soft cover came out in 1989 with this beautiful Walt Simonson cover, and that's the copy 14-year-old me got. And it's just this great. It's one of my favorites because, one, you're dealing with Batman's girlfriend Julie Madison, seen briefly in 1997's Academy Award-winning film Batman and Robin. Actually, I think it got robbed that year, which I'm kidding. I don't hate that film, but I don't think it should have won the Academy Award. But essentially, she runs afoul of vampires who turn into werewolves, which is on point for certain bits of mythology. And Batman has to go take care of it. And we get to see the Batarang for the first time. We get to see the Whirly Bat. He's shooting vampires with silver bullets. It's a really gothic little tale. And the cover to Detective Comics number 31 is amazing, with this looming image of Batman over a castle. It's just beautiful.
I think I remember that. One of the more iconic, death-like Batman covers I ever seen was, I think this Reaper character was taking a swipe at Robin on the cover.
Making a little editing for you, I apologize.
No, it's fine.
Yes.
I can't remember.
The vampire character was brought back by Jerry Conway.
Correct.
And then in the mid 2000s, as in the decade, the thousands, not the century so far.
Mm-hmm.
Matt Wagner did a 6-issue miniseries based on that story as well, which was very good. He also did one based on called Batman and the Monster Men, which was based on a Hugo Strange stories from Batman #1. But yeah, it's just I think in 1939 the idea of Batman fighting vampires was something kids would have really gotten a kick out of. I mean, I was 14 years old and I loved the story. But yeah, there's a great cover on Batman 351 of Batman howling at the night. He's got fangs. It looks like he's singing a Meatloaf song. It's amazing.
Not to continue down the Batman vampire path, but there's something I have to mention because it's so amazing, and I love the voice actor in it. In fact, he has just been announced. He was announced a few months ago, and it should be coming out, I think, this week or next week. Michael C. Hall will be doing the voiceover for the Stephen King novel Pet Sematary, and there has never been an audiobook from Pet Sematary ever released. And Michael C. Hall is going to be the voiceover for it, the narrator for it, and he was the voice of Kirk Langstrom, the Batman in Justice League Gods and Monsters.
That was a good movie. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
I hope. And of course, I've mentioned this to Mike Carlin, and he's like, I don't know, I can't talk about it. That they will make a sequel one day to that with new members of the Justice League that are as, like, dark, but still, I like in the end how, certain thing, it wasn't just an evil Justice League taking over the world. No, they were, like, still heroes, but in new ways that we love.
They were different. I mean, Batman was a vampire. General Zod's son was the Superman.
Yeah, and he's not like all just falling into his father's rule over the humans because they're weak. Because when he finds out the truth about his heritage, yes, he's General Zod's son, but he finds out what his father did. He's like, oh.
See, one of the problems when that film came out, it was at a time when they were doing like DC between various imprints and not Elseworlds, but like other like the Injustice game and Earth 2, which was a new 52 book. Seemed like they were going out of their way to let's do Superman as a bad guy stories. So and I think that Justice League Gods and Monsters kind of was elevated above that because it wasn't it wasn't even Kal-El. So you can kind of separate it completely, and then it's a more interesting story.
There was a amazing I don't know if this is considered in continuity, and I consider one-shots and like mini-series that are not directly tied into some event to be in continuity when they want it to be. Mm-hmm. But the Haunted Batman Prestige one-shots that came out by Tim Sale,
The Haunted.
They did 3 of them, and they collected them into one graphic.
Oh, the Legends of the Dark Knight specials.
Yes.
And this is the one that's basically a Christmas Carol, but with Batman, right?
Yeah, they did like 3 of them, didn't they?
The what?
They did 3 of them, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. They did one with the Scarecrow. They did one with the Mad Hatter, and then they did one that was kind of a takeoff of A Christmas Carol.
Correct. Okay.
The first one was the Scarecrow one, and it's amazing. The Mad Hatter one isn't as good. I think they tried, but and by the time they got to the Christmas Carol one, it was more of a Tim Sale art showcase than a Jeff Loeb story. But those were what led to Batman: The Long Halloween, which led to Batman: Dark Knight, the movie.
If I would love to have seen animated versions of those made.
I think they would hold. I think if you do anything animated versions of Batman, it's gonna sell. I mean, they don't do primarily Batman animated films because they just love Batman so much. I'm sure there's a financial consideration.
Oh,
there.
I'm sure they're making they're probably animated cheap overseas. They bring them back over and they sell them for whatever digital copy versus a DVD Blu-ray sells for.
But no, I liked all of those specials, which are a nice companion to the Long Halloween and to Dark Victory.
The which, if you look at Tim Sale's artwork in the Batman stuff, especially the Long Halloween, more so than Dark Victory, I think. Long Halloween, and again, not because the title is The Long Halloween, but the overall artwork and feel of that entire story was something out of a Saturday night murder mystery, crime noir horror story in a way.
It's funny because I'm a big believer, and we're going to get into, my thoughts on Batman and the supernatural pretty soon. But I'm a big believer that as much as I love the Rogues, as much as I love Joker and the Penguin and Two-Face and Catwoman and the other big ones, Poison Ivy, Bane, even I'm a pretty big fan of Bane, and he's kind of a more recent, if you can consider 25 years ago being recent, addition to the Rogues Gallery. I think, for my money, that if you really wanted to do and I think the movie The Dark Knight kind of bore this out, is that Batman versus the Mob is great. And that's what Long Halloween was, as much as it was, Batman in his first year and who is the Hangman and all that. I think it was more about Batman scaring the hell out of organized crime in Gotham City, and I just that speaks to me as a Batman fan.
One of the worst, and then I want you to share your thoughts on the Batman Supernatural, as you commented, was did you ever read the House of Bat? It was like a Frankenstein story.
That was another one I left on the shelf.
Yeah, me too.
There was just, I must have been buying something else that week. But it's one of those things where I'm kind of interested in it, just because that's an interesting concept. But I really, they're putting out more and more of these in trade paperback, so I'm hoping to pick those up. Because it's a little cheaper to buy a $25, $30 trade than 5 or 6, sometimes $8 books, depending on when it was released.
I've seen it at conventions so many times. I've seen it cheap, and so unless I find it in the 50-cent bin, I'm probably not going to buy it.
That's probably that's a smart way to go.
But it was there was when I was at the last comic book convention I went to, they had the Batman, Superman, Vampire, Werewolf 6-part trade paperback, and it took me forever to read it. And not because I set it down and I get back to it. Every time I picked it up, it was
I covered that last year on the Halloween episode that I did for my show. It All Comes Back to Superman.
Yes, you did.
And one, I will say I love the title. Superman and Batman versus vampires and werewolves. You know exactly what you're getting with the title. And they did not disappoint on having Superman, Batman, vampires, and werewolves. I think where that story kind of went off the rails is, one, the villain was nothing more than a reference. His name was nothing more than a reference to the Reanimator movies.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, it's the villain, Captain Name reference. And I was just like, Herbert West, who was played by Jeffrey Combs, in the Reanimator, who was also the Question in Justice League Unlimited, and probably one of the best things about that show, which I love all of it, so that says a lot. But I just, with the idea of having like super vampire werewolves hybrids, and you had this vampire and this werewolf that didn't get along, and the vampire, drank blood, but it was with a willing victim. I'm like, this is some pretty Tom Mandrake art. I am not feeling this story at all.
Yeah, that story just, You're right about the artwork. That might have been the thing that kept engaging me, but the everything else, I just couldn't do it.
But Batman and the Supernatural is one of those things that I think it's a natural, not to rhyme inadvertently there. I think when you have a character that's motif is a creature of the night and something that people have feared off and on for centuries, and something that is so closely associated in the pop culture with vampires, that eventually you would have him kind of mixing it up. And I think less is more, but I also think that when you do it every once in a while, it can make for a really engaging storyline. Just depending on how you do it. There's an issue of Batman that I absolutely love. That is from right around kind of the start of the post TV series era. It was written by Denny O'Neil with art by Irv Novick and Dick Giordano, called The Demon of Gothos Mansion.
Oh, yeah.
And it's basically a Hammer horror film with Batman in it, where he's searching for one of Alfred's many nieces that he's had over the years. And it turns into a ghost story, basically, where he falls in love with this spirit that just happens to look like one of Alfred's many nieces. And the villain isn't exactly drawn like Christopher Lee, but there are certain shots where that's like really Christopher Lee right there. Oh my God, that's almost exactly Christopher Lee. But that, and what I like about it is that there's a supernatural element to it, but it doesn't overwhelm the story, because basically the heart of the tale is that Batman is there to save Alfred's niece from a cult. And that's kind of a Batman thing to do, but there just happens to be this ghost involved.
I think you just gave yourself your next podcast idea for the overlooked Batman, the many nieces and siblings of Alfred Pennyworth. And you go all the way back to the beginning. You go all through the nieces, and then you finally get up to Batman Eternal with that short-haired cut chick, whatever her name is, the current his actual daughter, which I don't know how many daughters he's ever had. So
I know of at least two. One of them being a character, Julia Pennyworth, who was the daughter of Alfred and Mademoiselle Marie, who was a DC war character from the 60s. And she shows up in Alfred's life and becomes a romantic foil for Bruce Wayne. And there's this kind of triangle going on at one point with Bruce Wayne, Julia Pennyworth, and Vicky Vale. It was kind of fascinating, actually.
That sounds absolutely ridiculous. I'm just waiting for like one of the nieces or the daughters of Alfred to show up on Gotham.
Oh, I'm sure they'll be there eventually. If they're smart, they'll get a Doctor Who actress to play it.
That's right. Yeah, because he is the son of a Doctor Who.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. But there's also a classic Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams story called The Secret of the Secret? Really? I can speak. The Secret of the Waiting Graves from Detective Comics number 395, which is Batman going up against these two immortal barons, essentially. It was one. Okay. Can you guess that they involve death somehow? Their names are Juan and Dolores Muerto.
No. Who?
Yeah. So yeah, not on the nose at all. But no, it's this really great story that has this ending that is real. That I first read this in Batman from the 30s to the 70s, which was a book that was put out in 1971 by Crown Publishing. As you might imagine, has a bunch of stories about Batman from the 30s to the 70s. And this was one of the later stories in the book. And I was about 7 years old when I read this. So Batman going up against two people that are kept alive because of these flowers, and at the end of the story, they rot into corpses. That freaked the hell out of me when I was 7. And it was really one of those things where I think it was the first time a piece of literature disturbed me on some level. And of course, it was a Batman comic, so that's kind of funny when you think about it. But no, this is another one of those classic stories that has been reprinted at least 8 or 9 times in various collections.
I'll have to look it up.
You know, from the Showcase Presents books to the Neil Adams books. There have been a couple. There was in the early 2000s, in 1999, the early 2000s, DC put out a series of comics called Millennium Editions. I don't know if you remember this.
A little bit.
Where basically they reprinted key issues of DC books from the previous millennium to celebrate the new millennium, because at one point we were all really excited that the year 2000 was coming. That I think that's lost its luster after 18 years. I'm not quite sure, but they reprinted it there, and it's in the Batman: A Celebration of 75 Years hardcover. So it's like one of those Batman books that if you want to read it, it's out there. You can find it somewhere. I promise you.
And then the last thing I just remembered is, and this doesn't just affect Batman. Speaking, you know, they did. DC had this annual theme thing going on for a while. Marvel did it too, and they stopped, thankfully. And they were like, "Nope, we're not gonna do that anymore." They did Ghosts, an entire annual line of Ghosts, and I've never read a single one because I have just heard the worst things about a lot of the stories.
Okay, so DC annuals in the 90s were an interesting collection, varying degrees of, I guess the best way to describe it is, on one hand, it's kind of cool. On the other hand, it can be kind of what the hell, because on one hand, you had the Elseworlds annuals, which were pretty much overall really great. And then you had Bloodlines, which wasn't.
Yeah, well, and the best way to describe a lot of these, Michael, is DC's attitude towards what the 90s in comics was becoming, especially with Image Comics being like, "Oh, you want Image Comics versions of our characters? We're going to give you Image Comics versions of our characters, but you're not going to like them. Here's Asbats." And all these annuals that did, like, dark stuff.
Well, here's the thing. DC tried to cash in on the Image look starting about 1993. And it reached its apex, I think, in 1995. Because if you look at a lot of the crossovers from the Underworld Unleashed event, which is something I like. The premise was a little, and Mark Waid even cops to this, that they were being a little too cool for school with trying to update all these silly Silver Age villains from a demon named Naren. So it's Batman and the Supernatural. So this all fits. I'll make it work somehow, I promise. But I read every single crossover issue from that for a podcast I did years ago. It's not like when I reread Genesis, which was another DC crossover from 1997, which is categorically awful, which I still wake up screaming, I have to say. But when you look at DC during that time period, there were some books where it was very obvious that they were trying to cash in on that, and it just never gelled with DC as a company because that's not who they were. And finally in 96, after Kingdom Come came out, it seemed like DC finally pulled out of the skid, essentially. And suddenly were, for my money, the best superhero publisher of the 90s. From 96 all the way up into the 2000s. Ghosts was the unifying theme of the various Justice League character annuals, because in 1997 they did a series of annuals with all of their annuals called Pulp Heroes. And you had Tales of Suspense and other little things like that, which is a Marvel title. I realize I'm getting it wrong. But in 1998, DC completely pulled back on the annuals they produced, and they only produced annuals based on the members of the main members of the JLA. And Superman's dealt with the Phantom Zone villains that he had executed in Superman number 22. Batman's was actually one of the earliest Batman stories written by Devin Grayson, when she was still going by Devin Cayley Grayson. I read this. I have absolutely no memory of it. I know I read it. It has a beautiful Bernie Wrightson cover, but I have no memory of how this story goes. And I feel really thick-headed for that because I used to own it. I've sold a lot of my books recently, but I bought that book off the stands. So, wow. But Ghost was not as bad as people have led you to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think you should give them a shot.
The book, by the way, I was thinking of, because I had to do some research why it was racking my brain, why I kept saying the Blue Amazon wasn't published. The Blue Amazon was published, and going back to the German expression books they put out, the Green Light was supposed to be a Green Lantern, naturally, expressionist book that they canceled.
Well, that's too bad. I would have liked to have seen, dark, depressing, confusing Green Lantern stories.
Didn't we just get that this week in Earth 1 Green Lantern?
I've heard good things about that. So
I have too. I just had to find something to pick on Green Lantern about, and everyone's already shit all over the movie enough times. So,
but hey, you and me and everyone listening to this, I actually like that movie.
Oh, okay, you're done.
Really, that's the breaking point.
You are freaking done. Okay. But to end this on a high note, and it hasn't been completed yet, and I know there are mixed feelings about it, but Jesus Christ, considering where the guy came from, the Batman Metal storyline right now is absolutely terrifying if you read it, thinking about, the context of everything that's happening in it. All the one-shots, all the terrible versions of Batman from the multiverse. Just what happened to Batman in that story? It is a true horror story of a comic book.
I have not been reading Metal, but I'm going to tell you this. I really appreciate the fact that DC is doing it, and here's why. For the majority of the New 52, DC seemed to take... And this is the outsider looking in. This is not based on any inside information. This is just me looking at, hype pieces and interviews and the books themselves as they're coming out. It seemed like DC wanted to take a one-size-fits-all approach to their universe and have everything be a certain way. And if you liked it, fine. But if you didn't, don't let the door hit your ass on the way out. Whereas after Rebirth, it seems and with all of these new initiatives they've announced recently, with the Sandman stuff that's coming out, and the young adult graphic novels that they're going to be doing, and the Metal,
and don't forget the most important one of all, the return of the red panties on Superman.
Yeah, we really don't want to have that conversation. I'm excited that the trunks are coming back.
I am too.
But I like the fact that DC has recognized that there are people and readers that like things like what are being done in the Metal storyline. And like Greg Capullo, who's I think Greg Capullo can be considered one of the greatest Batman artists of all time.
Oh, God, yeah.
I think he did enough work on that character during the New 52 with Scott Snyder that he is up there with Breyfogle and Adams and Novick, Aparo and Nolan, just the greats of the Batman artists from the almost 80 years of the character's history. And John Romita Jr. has been in on this. And again, it's not something that interests me. It seems to be spinning off into interesting directions.
The new series coming out.
The fact that DC is like, if you don't like that, here's James Tynion on Detective and Tom King on Batman with a more, kind of straightforward kind of Batman storytelling, or what they're doing on Superman right now. It just seems like DC is giving us options. And I really appreciate that. As a fan of the company and as a DC kid, more than anything else, I like plenty of the Marvel characters. I'm a huge Hulk and Captain America fan, and I've loved the movies as they've been coming out. And there have been books from the past century, this century that I've really liked. But at heart, I'm a DC kid. I love the JSA. I love Batman and Robin. Whether that's Dick Grayson or Tim Drake, I'm just a fan of Batman and Robin. The fact that, like I said, they've been doing this metal thing that's really different, that's great. And I'm glad people are enjoying it. And I know I'm doing the internet wrong by saying that, because if it's not something I like, it's terrible. At least that's what the fan group seems to be, but that's just not where my mind is right now.
No, but you could also, once it's all said and done and finally completed, which it should be like any day now, you could always wait until it's in trade. You could wait until it's like in the cheap trades and finally be like, hey, that's worth $10 to finally pick up the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, same thing with like a lot of people I know who are not jumping right on, and it's affected Batman in like 1 or 2 issues, and it's not so much horror related, but the Doomsday Clock has hopefully not going to be delayed for much longer, because I know we've kind of skipped the month of March with the next issue, but I know people are waiting until that entire thing is finished to finally give it a chance, just to see how it is.
I'm a fan of Doomsday Clock. I've been really enjoying it. I've been reading it as it comes out, and I think Doomsday Clock, people who read metal would probably enjoy Doomsday Clock, but for people that don't want to jump on that train, they have another train they can get on.
True, and I know a lot of people are not jumping on it just because they're waiting for like, oh, when's it going to start tying into every goddamn book that I have to read? And I'm like, hopefully never. It seems like it's going to be a self-contained 12-issue series that's going to affect the DC universe once it's completed, because we've already had the build-up to it in Action Comics, but Action Comics is going to start going off into its own Bendis thing, so...
Yeah, and you had the Mr. the Lonely Place of Living, or whatever that storyline was called in Detective, that tied into it.
The Button.
And the Button, and which was the Button was great.
Yeah.
I can't recommend the Button enough. That was a great Batman Flash story.
Mm-hmm.
But for a summation, basically, I think that when done right, no can defend against a good Batman supernatural story.
Absolutely.
I think the character lends himself to that, mainly because of his aesthetic. But I also think that, it's just fun, to see Batman mixing it up with ghosts and vampires and werewolves. And sometimes it's terrible, like in that Superman and Batman versus vampires and werewolves. But sometimes, like with the Demon of Gothos Mansion, or those early detective issues, or... even though it's not technically the supernatural, because the Monster Men are monsters created by Hugo Strange.
Oh, yeah.
That storyline is great.
That wasn't too bad.
You really need to pick up the Batman miniseries that Matt Wagner did back around 2006, 2007 that retold those stories. Because they're just so well done. And I can't recommend them enough.
Yeah, the Monster Men, I almost forgot about that, because it kind of came and went in the middle of a great run of New 52, Rebirth Batman stories. But I highly recommend checking it out as well. The artwork in it, especially for the alternate covers that aren't Tim Sale, are pretty great. And it's like Batman versus monster H.P. Lovecraft kaiju type stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hey Michael, thank you so much for coming back on the show to talk about a little bit of Batman versus the Supernatural. Why don't you plug away what you have coming up and what is hopefully returning soon?
From Crisis to Crisis is returning soon.
In the same month as many anniversaries.
Jeffrey Taylor, who is my co-host of that show, and I have been plugging away. We're building up a large reserve of episodes so that we can keep them coming out on a somewhat regular basis.
Yay! So
even if we don't keep a weekly schedule, we'll keep a regular schedule.
Gotcha.
And you can find that at the Fortress of Bailettude podcasting network, which is located at fortressofbailettude.com, where you can find shows like The Overlooked Dark Knight, if you want to hear my friend Andy and I talk about Batman stories from the late 70s. And recently we've started covering, on the second show of the month, the Batman Adventures books, the various comics that were based on the animated series from the 90s.
Oh, yes.
Because some of those are amazing, and very few, I don't want to say no one is talking about them, because I know there are a couple people out there that are plugging away at it, but I don't think a lot of people know about them.
Except for one issue in particular.
Well, yeah. Man, I really regret not picking that up in all the 50-cent boxes I saw it in the 90s.
I had a copy, and I just, tossed it, not in the trash, but I tossed it in a pile of comics I gave away.
First comic book appearance of Harley Quinn, now $300, $400 book.
or more in some places. I've seen it go for $1,000.
So, but thank you so much for asking me, Chris. I appreciate you having me on to ramble on about Batman, because I love the character, and I love horror too. So you're letting me play in a lot of different pools here, basically.
Oh, absolutely.
Thanks a lot, sir.
You can find this episode and all the other episodes on the Radio Free America, and then you can also find it on the Radio Horror YouTube channel. Check out this episode and the other episode Michael's in, Superman versus the Supernatural. And please like, subscribe, comment, and leave us as well as on YouTube, and check out the Radio Horror Facebook page. Thank you, everybody.